The Timberwolves trading Karl-Anthony Towns to the New York Knicks left a lot of people scratching their heads wondering why Minnesota would do this, seemingly getting worse after a trip to the Western Conference Finals. Now, regardless of if you think this trade made them better or if this trade made them worse, I don't think this trade was necessarily made with the intention of making the Timberwolves better in the immediate future. I think this trade isn't just looking one step ahead, but 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead, multiple years down the road, and it was necessary in order for the Timberwolves to have any chance at long-term success. Now let me explain. Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be making $49 million next season, $53 million the season after that, $57 million the season after that, and then in 2027-28, he has a player option for a whopping $61 million. On average, his contract is expected to take up over 30% of the salary cap over the course of the next 4 years. In terms of average annual value, this is the 10th largest contract in the entire NBA. There's no way around it. This contract is a massive outlier. It really doesn't even matter if you think Cat's a good or a bad player, and in the context of the Timberwolves, it's almost not even relevant. The question that was looming over the Timberwolves throughout this offseason is if they should run it back with the same group of guys. After all, they just made it to the Western Conference Finals. That's pretty good. But even what they did in the playoffs last year isn't necessarily relevant. The most important question for the Timberwolves is, was this team good enough to win a championship? If the answer to that question is no, then it poses a follow-up question. If this team isn't good enough to win a championship, then how do they get better? Well, let's look at their roster. Anthony Edwards obviously isn't going anywhere. That's who they're going to be building around long term. The next 2 biggest contracts are Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns. Now you might say, well, they should have traded Gobert instead of Cat. And I understand that there is probably some rationale behind this, but I do think for the Timberwolves, it boiled down to Rudy Gobert is on a less expensive contract and also a shorter term contract. This is the last year of his deal before that player option. And I think Minnesota's probably going to try and extend him on more of a team friendly deal that allows them to have some flexibility while keeping him on the roster long term. That kind of left Karl-Anthony Towns as the odd man out when you're looking at, okay, what can the Timberwolves realistically do to get better? Who can they potentially move? At the root of all of this is the collective bargaining agreement. Minnesota was staring down the barrel of multiple years of punishment for being over the second apron. Their active salary this year is clocking in at $203.5 million, meaning they're going to be about $13 million above the second apron. Now, why is this a problem? Well, if you're above the second apron, this means that you can't use the mid-level exception, you can't trade multiple players in one deal, you can't use traded player exceptions, you can't trade cash, you can't trade first-round picks from 7 years into the future, and if you remain above the second apron for 2 out of 4 following seasons, your first-round pick 7 years out is automatically moved to the end of the first round, regardless of your record. Knowing how punitive it is to be a second apron team, if you're operating under the assumption that, yes, last year's Timberwolves team was very good, but not quite good enough to win a championship, then it doesn't benefit them in any way to continue being a second apron team. And they needed to make this move to allow them to have that flexibility to get to the point where, yes, they are good enough to compete for a championship. They swapped Karl-Anthony Towns' contract that's not only one of the biggest contracts in the league, but also still has 4 years left on it. And they got in return an absolute steal of a contract in Donte DiVincenzo's deal. And then also Julius Randle's contract, which not only is cheaper than Cat's, but also only has 1, potentially 2 years left on it. From an asset management perspective, this is an absolute stroke of genius from Tim Connolly, and here's why. Now, I fully foresee them keeping Donte DiVincenzo around long term. His contract runs through the end of 2027, and this locks down legitimately one of the best shooters in the entire NBA. There were 30 players in the NBA attempting at least 7 threes a night last year, and of those 30 players, Donte was the 6th most efficient. This is important because the Timberwolves were bottom 10 in three-point attempt frequency last year, despite ranking number 1 in three-point efficiency. They are absolutely elite when they're attempting threes, but they're just not taking enough of them. Now they add one of the highest volume three-point shooters in the league, something that's going to open up a ton for their offense long term. And I'm not saying that Donte DiVincenzo is poised to be some all-star caliber player, but he did prove that he can do a lot more than just be a spot-up shooter last year. After Julius Randle went down with an injury in January, 𝙖𝙗𝙤𝙪 nearly doubled his point production while maintaining some really solid efficiency. Also, over this stretch, Donte was shooting 38.7% from 3 on 11.9 attempts per game. That made him the second highest volume 3-point shooter in the NBA over that span. The Timberwolves don't necessarily need him to do that much, but it's definitely going to be a huge help. He's also a very solid competitor on the defensive end. At the very least, I would consider him to be a totally passable defender, although I definitely wouldn't be calling him elite or anything like that. The Timberwolves are fully equipped to handle any of his weaknesses as a defender, and I think he's probably going to have a career year defensively just by nature of being in such a solid defensive infrastructure. But what about Julius Randle? Well, his contract, like I said, comes with a much more reasonable price tag. He'll make $33 million this season, and then his player option after that only comes in at $30.9 million. But let's say that the Timberwolves plan on keeping him around. Theoretically, what are they going to be able to get out of him? Does he fit with this team, and how does he fit? I actually think Julius Randle is going to be very useful doing some supplementary creation and offensive facilitating. One of the issues that the Timberwolves ran into in the playoffs was a lack of creation when Ant was on the bench and Conley had to get some rest. I think one of the biggest parts of this trade for the Timberwolves is that you don't have to put all of that burden on Anthony Edwards and Mike Conley, who's starting to get up there in age. One of the things that Julius Randle still does at a really, really high level is create out of post-ups when he's able to draw doubles, recognize defenders cheating, and he can just make those simple passes one pass away. I'm really interested to see how Minnesota utilizes him as a high post playmaker. They did some of that stuff with Kyle Anderson, but I think they're going to be able to get a lot out of Julius Randle in this way. And defenses treat him like an aggressive scorer, so he's oftentimes able to get them to show extra bodies on him, and from there he's able to create tons of open looks for his teammates. Him and Anthony Edwards are also pretty high volume drivers, with Anthony Edwards averaging 14.6 drives per game and Julius Randle averaging 13.9. I'm really excited to see how they're going to operate on the floor together when creating off of these drives. As much as I like Karl-Anthony Towns, this is a significantly less clunky fit because Cat isn't being forced to play out of position. Julius Randle is a true power forward with the ability to sometimes operate as a center in small ball lineups, and I think Minnesota is going to get a ton out of that from the perspective of their overall versatility. A big thing for Randle is going to have to be his three-point shooting, because more than likely the Timberwolves are going to want the ball in Anthony Edwards' hands most of the time, and so it's going to make life a lot easier for everybody if Julius Randle's knocking down his catch and shoot looks. And even though his efficiency doesn't look the best last year from a three-point shooting perspective, he actually shot fine on catch and shoot shots. He hit him at a 35.4% clip, which isn't ideal. You definitely want that to be higher. Hopefully this season that takes a step up a little bit. Julius Randle is still a very, very good player at his best. Now, the big questions are, is he going to be healthy, and are they going to get the best version of him? But if they end up with the best case scenario of Julius Randle, then I see no reason why this team can't still be considered a legitimate contender. Imagine if he was able to get back to that point where he was averaging 24 points, 6 assists on 40% three-point shooting. That's a player that, to me, puts the Timberwolves in that top tier of contender. And assuming the young guys on the team continue to develop, and obviously Anthony Edwards continues to develop, then this is an insanely good team. And guess what? Even if Julius Randle's not working out, even if he's not performing very well, one, his contract is going to expire in 1, potentially 2 seasons. And then also, if it's not working out, they can just trade him. They turned Cat into, at minimum, 1 positive asset with Donte 𝙖𝙗𝙤𝙪. They gave themselves more salary cap flexibility. They got a draft pick, which may or may not convey, and now they can either move forward with Randle or, as a contingency plan, be ready to move him if it's not working out. In this new era of the NBA, under this new collective bargaining agreement, teams are sometimes going to have to take 1 step backwards to take 2 steps forward. Regardless of if you think this trade makes them better or worse, it was necessary. Now they're actually going to have that flexibility that's necessary to retool so that they can compete with any team in the NBA. Really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It seriously helps out the channel so much. Regardless, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.